Yeah, sure.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Lucy Sorensen. I'm an assistant professor at the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy. Is my voice projecting back there? Okay, great. So we'll be presenting research in progress we've been working on, also having to do with the property tax cap, and this time its impact on school districts. And this is work joint with Youngsung Kim and Moontae Hwang, who are graduate students also at the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy at SUNY Albany. Okay, so I'm fortunate in that Dr. Bronner has already done a lot of the introduction on what is the tax cap, but I want to set the scene a little bit in terms of what was the historical impetus for this tax cap, what were some of the immediate impacts. So moving into 2011, there'd been this growing pressure to want to alleviate some of the soaring property tax burden that was happening across the state. Just to throw a few statistics out there, in 2010, based on the median effective property tax rate, the 15 highest taxing counties in the United States were all in New York State. This is based on that Rockefeller Institute report by Jim Malatris, Nick Simmons, and Michelle Cummings. And they found that each year, on average, before the recession, property taxes had been growing by about 6% per year. So, to just being very high, they were also steadily increasing. And finally, we have some of the highest per pupil education expenditures. So at that time, we were the highest in terms of per pupil spending. It was a little bit higher than $20,000 at that time. It's gone up since then. And so there was a lot of reason to think that this tax cap could help to both reduce property taxes and also slow the growth of soaring education expenses. I won't go over too many of the policy details themselves because Dr. Bronner talked about these, but it was enacted to affect counties, local governments, special districts like fire districts, as well as school districts, which will be the focus of our study. And it limited the growth from year to year in property revenues to either 2% or the inflation rate, whichever was lower. The big five school districts were exempt, and it could be overruled through a 60% majority vote. We found in the data that we're looking about each year, somewhere between, let's say, 20 to 50 school districts will try and override the cap, and 60% of the time they were successful. This is another Rockefeller Institute statistic, $25.6 billion, they said has been saved since the tax was implemented. So this is in terms of residential property taxes. And of that, I believe it was $16.7 billion just from school district property revenues. And so there have been really enormous savings based on these estimates. And so the question is, what is the impact for us on the public education system? And this is part of a broader national movement. So starting in 1978 with California's Proposition 13 referendum. And there's been a lot of research looking at what are the effect of tax and expenditure limits, or TELs, on local finances and public service delivery. And so in general, they found that they're effective at reducing local revenue growth and reducing the reliance on property taxes. But there were several studies that came out in the 1990s showing that after a TEL was implemented, student achievement might go down, education revenues become lower, and that there could be some adverse consequences. And finally, it's unclear what are going to be the effects in terms of equity. So there's been contradictory evidence in terms of whether this makes funding more equal, less equal, and same for the student achievement outcomes themselves. Okay, so our two research questions. Basically, how did the property tax cap affect the level of education provision across the state? And then how did the tax cap affect the distribution of both revenues and educational achievement across the state? And I think this is particularly important in the New York context because we have this huge local revenue gap. And I'll talk about how we define low wealth and high wealth districts in a second. But we see on average that these low wealth districts are collecting about, this is in 2016, $8,700 per pupil in revenues, and the high wealth districts are collecting on average almost 27,000. So there are these huge discrepancies in terms of local revenue collection. And we do have an equalizing state aid system, right? So it is the case that the state is giving a lot more money towards these low wealth districts, but that equalization isn't always enough to close the gap. I'm sorry, the other thing is that in terms of achievement between these two types of districts, the difference in their average math and reading scores is about 2 standard deviations. And so that's, in real terms, that's multiple grade levels. So you'll see that these high need districts are multiple grade levels behind in terms of their test score performance. Okay, I believe one of the other papers already talked a little bit about needs to resource capabilities, but this is how we define wealth, and it's comparing a district's needs in terms of the percentage of the district in poverty to its resources, which is its combined wealth ratio. And so we are going to look specifically at these high needs districts, which are above the 70th percentile in needs to resources, and then low needs resources, which are below the 20th percentile, and comparing the effects across these 3 different groups of districts. Our data, we're pulling from the comptroller's data, as well as New York State Education Department, and we're looking at 663 school districts between 2006 and 2016. So unfortunately, we don't have the 2 most recent years. We'd love to update this project and look at what have been the impacts in the last 2 years, but right now, this is the time period we're looking at for those school districts, excluding the big 5 cities. Okay, so in order to do this study, we're going to create a new measure. We call it tax cap pressure in our paper. And so basically what we want to define is how constrained a certain school district in a certain year is going to be by the tax cap, right? So we create predicted levies based on just linear forecasting from the pre-tax cap period. Seems like there are some forecasting gurus in the room, and so we use a very naive method, but it's actually extremely accurate in our data. And then we also compare that to the allowed levies, which is this either 2% increase from the year before or inflation rate increase from the year before with a variety of adjustments, which were the special exclusions that you talked about. And so our tax cap pressure is comparing these two and saying what percent of the predicted levies of this district are going to be above the allowed amount. So how constrained are they by that tax cap? Our method is basically to run a series of regressions where the outcomes are different revenue sources and different education outcomes. And we try and control for and account for a variety of different things at the district level that could also be affecting these outcomes. And so I'm happy to talk about this in the Q&A, but we account for as many different factors as we possibly can, and time trends as well. Okay, so this is what our measure, this tax cap pressure, looks like, the one I just described. You'll notice it's 0 through 2012. That's by definition, right, because without the tax cap that was introduced starting in 2013, there's no tax cap pressure. Districts can collect anything they want, and then after that time, it starts to increase, right? And this blue line up top, those are going to be your low needs districts or your wealthier districts, and so they're going to be the ones who are most constrained by the tax cap. The other 2 lines, red is the average, green is the high needs, and so they're also affected, but not as much as the wealthier districts. And the second thing to note about this is that it's on a pretty clear upward trend, right? So this is as the state is recovering from the recession, we're seeing the tax cap is becoming more and more binding over time. So this is the geographic distribution of tax cap pressure. This is in 2016. there's a pretty clear picture here. So this is the difference in per pupil property levies between what is predicted and what is allowed. And so this is a pretty clear, at least in the dollar amount, it's a pretty clear pattern. The downstate and wealthier districts here are more constrained by the tax. Upstate less so, but there's still several districts in the upstate area that are heavily affected by the tax. This is going to be between $1,500 per pupil or more for those darker blue regions. When we do it by percent, it looks more evenly distributed. So the reason that it's concentrated in those areas is because we're talking about raw dollar figures. Okay, so these are the results of our regressions. I'll tell you how you can go about reading this. So this is the effect of a 1% increase in tax cap pressure. So it's very small. And these are revenues measured in thousands of dollars per pupil. The stars just mean that they're all significant. And so in terms of the magnitude, what we're finding is that a 10% increase in tax cap pressure leads to a $236 decrease in local education revenues. So not a huge amount, but it still is significant. And interestingly, we see these very small increases in state aid and other revenues, which is often federal revenues. And so we are seeing some type of compensatory mechanism that we're trying to figure out more about in terms of as the tax cap is more binding, they're also receiving a little bit more in state aid and federal revenue. And so once you add these all up, you get about an aggregate $120 per pupil loss in education revenues from a 10% increase in the tax cap pressure. So now we look to see how these translate to actual student achievement outcomes. And we find here, you read this table the same way, a 1% increase in tax cap pressure. We do find significant decreases in math and reading performance for those districts who are more heavily affected by the cap. And so in terms of the magnitude here, we see a 10% increase in pressure from the tax cap, means a loss of 0.03 standard deviations in math and reading. What is 0.03 standard deviations? It's about 1/10 of an average grade level gain. So the difference between a 6th grader and a 7th grader, this is equivalent to about 1/10 of a school year loss of learning in terms of this test score performance. If we were, and this is corresponding to about a 120 loss in per pupil revenues. If you scaled that up to the districts who are losing much more revenues in our sample, then $1,000 per pupil loss would translate into about a half of a grade level loss in math and reading. So we stated that one of our goals was to look at not only the average impacts of the tax cap, but also across different types of districts. And I think this has been kind of an interesting part of this study. So here we have, this zero line would imply that there's no effect. Here we have the effect for the wealthier districts, the average districts, and then the high need districts. And we find this negative effect on reading performance. It looks the same for math as well in high need and average need districts, but interestingly, a positive effect for the more disadvantaged districts. And so we're still trying to figure that out. But it seems like whatever this negative impact we're seeing of the tax cap, it's not happening for those high need to resource districts. And partly it just boils down to how much money they're losing, right? So here is the average revenue loss per pupil from the tax cap. Blue is, again, our wealthier districts. And so by 2016, they're losing about $4,000 per pupil. And for the high need resource, they're only losing less than $1,000 per pupil on average from the tax cap by 2016. So there are just these very differential impacts across different types of districts. So in summary, we've seen these beneficial reductions in the burden to taxpayers across the state. But there might be some significant consequences in terms of the education funding and the educational outcomes. And interestingly, there's this divergent effect for the high and low wealth districts, where we think maybe the low wealth districts might be buffered from the fact that they're not very reliant on property taxes, and they're getting a lot of state aid that can help compensate for those losses. I think another interesting thing that we've been thinking about is a lot of those earlier studies of tax and expenditure limits look, they're in different states and different contexts, but they're also not looking necessarily after a school finance reform and a school finance equalization that's been as aggressive as the one in New York. And so we're seeing that the interaction of these two systems means that the property tax cap in New York has been very progressive, right, in the sense that it's, to the extent that it's having negative impacts, they're only happening for the high wealth areas. Unfortunately, there's kind of a downside in that we talked about how we wanted to study the achievement gap between more advantaged and more disadvantaged areas. And the ideal way to reduce an achievement gap would be to bring up the bottom end of the distribution. We're seeing a reduction in the achievement gap possibly by bringing down the top end of the distribution. And so even if this isn't an ideal policy lever for getting at the achievement gap, maybe in conjunction with the school finance equalization, it could have lead to more equitable distribution. And so none of us are politicians, we're all researchers, but I do think that as we're thinking about the tax cap, it's important to think about all the different benefits that have come from this tax cap, but then also what are the costs of public service delivery, and how do we mitigate those consequences as we move forward. Thank you.